When they said that the pen is mightier than the sword, I'm sure no one was imagining someone actually using a pencil instead of a sword. But that's John Wick for you. In 2014, nobody expected this modestly budgeted action flick starring Keanu Reeves as a grieving widower to end up becoming a full-blown franchise. But that's what happened, and everybody can see why now. With its hyper-stylized, almost ballet-like gun and fighting choreography and rich underground mythology, John Wick manages to transport you directly into a world that you can definitely believe in. John Wick became a lightning rod in modern action cinema, redefining the genre. The audiences weren't just drawn to the violence, they were drawn to the lore, the sacred ground, the gold coins, the Continental, and of course, the idea of a secret society hiding in plain sight. And honestly, all of us understood why someone would go on a murderous rampage over the death of their pet. I sure would. You stay away from my fish tank. Anyways, by the time John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum hit theaters, the universe had expanded well beyond the humble origins it had. The films had already doubled down on the arcane rules that govern this secret society. We saw the Adjudicator, the Elder, the Bowery King, and of course, the Continental Hotel itself in detail. By this time, it was evident that John Wick was more than just another revenge story. It had a rich mythos, and it had potential. So, as you can guess, Hollywood immediately took notice. If the assassin universe ran deep, it's only fair to mine it, right? And that's where we meet the Continental from the world of John Wick. This three-part miniseries, designed as a prequel to John Wick, was set in 1970s New York, where we saw the rise of a young Winston Scott, the man who would later become the manager of the Continental Hotel in the films. It wasn't a spin-off story, it was supposed to be the origin story of one of the most enigmatic and intriguing characters in the Wickverse, set in the past with a lot of unspoken promises about grime, grit, and potential. On paper, this show had all the right ingredients. You had a stylish retro backdrop, you had connections to beloved characters, and of course, you had the built-in intrigue of the Assassin Hotel's early days. Fans were promised blood, loyalty, and betrayal, and also answers to the High Table's never-ending mysteries. But here's the thing, when the show finally premiered in late 2023 on Peacock, the response to it was tepid at best. You would expect a massive cultural splash, some memes here and some Reddit theories there for Easter eggs, but nope, you got none of that. For a franchise that practically revived action fans all over the world, the Continental barely had any such effect. So you have to wonder, what the hell happened? Well, that's what we want to find out today. Join us as we dive into the rise and the rapid fall of the Continental, a prequel which was so ambitious, which promised so much, and yet ended up falling flat. To understand what exactly happened to the Continental, we have to go back roughly a decade. Let's rewind to 2017. 3 years after the first John Wick film was released, Lionsgate made a bold announcement saying they were already working on a TV spin-off series centered around the Continental hotels. We were going to see how all of these safe havens for the contract killers functioned, and this wasn't supposed to be a cash grab. According to Lionsgate, they just really wanted to deepen the mythos. As an idea, this was completely irresistible to fans and critics. The Continental in the film was a character in its own right. It was a sacred, bulletproof zone where the killers checked in, cleaned up, negotiated, and then prepared their next moves. The Continental embodied everything that made John Wick bigger than any other action film you've seen in recent years. There were rules, there were rituals, and of course, there was an unsaid reverence about the place. Lionsgate wanted this show to be gritty and a very grounded exploration of the criminal underworld. They wanted to explore the infrastructure behind the scenes instead of focusing on a singular character like John Wick. They wanted to give us more understanding of the High Table, the neutrality laws, the economy of the coins, and why the assassins worked under these codes. This TV show was basically like John Wick without John Wick. This obviously opens the door to a whole new question, which was, can this show even run without Keanu Reeves? This was the main gamble. You see, Keanu was the anchor of the entire franchise. He was the emotional investment and the main star. Wick was a man grieving the loss of his wife and his pet. His pain and precision made him reliable. So, if we were to remove John Wick from the equation, in a way, the entire human core of the show would be removed. Despite that being a huge gamble, the producers remained confident. They believed that the Continental would be a beast in its own regard. It would be slick and violent and would shift the focus from individual vendettas to the world that catered to those individual vendettas. But of course, on paper, everything sounds great. Things get a lot more tricky when you start developing the project, and developing this beast turned out to be far more complicated than anyone thought it would be. The journey of the Continental behind the scenes can be best described as chaotic. Originally, the project was greenlit by Starz. In case you don't know, Starz is a network that mostly has edgy genre shows like Spartacus and American Gods. So of course, once Starz greenlit the Continental, this show faced almost immediate turbulence. Development was delayed, writers came and went, tones clashed, and producers shuffled like a deck of cards at a casino. In fact, at one point, John Wick producer Basil Iwanek stepped away from the project only to return when the series changed creative direction yet again. The earliest plan for the Continental was supposed to be a longer and more serialized run. We were basically going to get an anthology series where we'd go to multiple cities and multiple hotels, all in the Wickverse. As you probably know, this vision never quite materialized. Then, from Starz, this project changed hands and went to Peacock, NBC Universal's streaming platform. This shift not only marked a change in distribution, but also showed uncertainty in how the show should exist in the first place. Was this a neo-noir character study? Was it a retro crime caper? Was it prestige television? Who knows? In the meantime, the director's duties were being shuffled around between hands too. Ultimately, it landed with Albert Hughes, who had co-directed Menace to Society and The Book of Eli. Thanks to Hughes, this show got a grittier and street-level vibe to it, which is definitely different from the smooth, neon-drenched aesthetic we saw in the films. He created episodes 1 and 3, while Charlotte Brandstrom, the director behind The Witcher and The Rings of Power, handled episode 2. This was definitely not an ideal move. The tonal difference between the episodes is quite literally in your face. Even before the show aired, there were whispers suggesting that Lionsgate and the creative team were unable to decide the project's identity. Some insiders claimed that there were a lot of rewrites and the scripts varied between high-concept action and gangster drama. But that wasn't even the biggest problem. The elephant in the room was the budget. The film series was definitely profitable, and there's no denying how well the franchise did. But here's the thing, the Continental had a much leaner budget than the films. Reports have suggested that each episode costs around $20 million, which is a fraction of the blockbuster money that was poured into Chapter 4. So, with these kinds of budget constraints, everything was affected. There were fewer large-scale shootouts, there were smaller sets, and the creative limitations, thanks to the budget, affected everything, as you might have guessed. So, by the time the show finally aired in September 2023, it was already 6 years late, and in Hollywood, 6 years is a whole eternity and a giant red flag. While the wait was painful, fans were surprisingly okay with waiting, but the wait has to be worth it, right? But it didn't work out like that. One of the most baffling aspects of the Continental's production, other than all the drama that we've mentioned so far, has to be how it shifted constantly in format. Initially, you remember, this show was envisioned as an anthology series. The idea was that each season would focus on different Continental hotels across the globe, so Season 1 might have taken place in Tokyo, Season 2 in Berlin, 3 in Cairo, and so on and so forth. It was going to be White Lotus for killers. Each season, we'd meet a new manager, new assassins, and see how the Continental had its own local flavor. The possibilities, when you think about it, were endless. This kind of approach would have allowed the show to expand in the Wickverse laterally without being focused on a single character. This idea had the fans excited because it fit the transnational ethos of the films. After all, in the movies, we're constantly jumping from country to country, culture to culture, and language to language. But somewhere along the way, the plan was lost in translation. Instead of being this way, the show narrowed its focus, and now we're seeing the rise of Winston Scott in 1970s New York. This decision made sense narratively, but in terms of the scope, it limited the show drastically. Instead of being an expansion, we got a prequel, which was not necessarily something we were even excited about. Things were made even more confusing with the structure of the show. Each episode ran between 80 and 90 minutes, making the Continental a trilogy of TV movies instead of a serialized drama. Some fans definitely appreciated the cinematic format, but others found it completely jarring and disjointed. There were no cliffhangers, there wasn't any weekly momentum that you usually get with serialized drama, so there was nothing going for the Continental that would generate buzz or conversation amongst fans. So when it aired, fans were mostly just confused. Was this a miniseries? Was it a backdoor pilot? Or was it a one-off? Honestly, even the creators seemed unsure. The show was framed as a limited series, but then producers hinted at possible continuations, spin-offs, anthology revivals, all of which never came to be. In the end, this format felt like a compromise between too many competing visions. Everything from artistic ambition to fan expectations to network constraints was pulling the show in different directions, which made it jarring. But despite all of that, all the developmental turbulence, the Continental still had the potential to soar in the casting and visual identity field, or at least that's what we all hoped for. Then, the Continental finally rolled out its casting announcements, and the reactions were mixed at best. Some were curious, some were hopeful, and others were simply confused. The role of young Winston Scott went to Colin Woodell, who is best known for his work in The Flight Attendant and Abduction. Woodell, as the younger version of Ian McShane, who played a character who became a fan favorite because of his proper mix of of charm, menace, and refined British deliveries was a gamble in itself. Thankfully, Woodell didn't try to mimic McShane's cadence or mannerisms at all. Instead, he brought his own take on the role, someone earnest, calculating, and yet confident and ruthless enough that it echoed the older Winston we knew so well. But this was the main source of the problem. Woodell's performance as Winston was serviceable, but it wasn't magnetic. There was no swagger, there was no quiet menace. Gone was the sense that Winston Scott was always 2 steps ahead. All the things that McShane brought to the table never came through in Woodell's interpretation. He wasn't bad, he just wasn't memorable either. But an even more divisive casting decision was having Mel Gibson play the role of Cormac, the villainous manager of the Continental in the 1970s, and Winston's primary antagonist in the show. Even before the show aired, fans weren't happy with Gibson being involved with this project. His controversies were well documented, from racist and anti-Semitic remarks to years of being exiled from the industry. So all of that cast a shadow over the project, and fans wondered why a franchise which was as slick and progressive as John Wick would even bother having such a polarizing figure at the center. From a performance standpoint, Gibson oozed menace and unpredictability. He cranked the volatile nature, cruelty, and manipulativeness of Cormac to 100, and he portrayed him as someone who was clinging to power through violence and fear, and while he did have moments of genuine intensity, he often simply veered too much into cartoonish villainy. The worst part was that the writing didn't help at all. Cormac wasn't layered or complex. He should have been a formidable figure, but in the end, he ended up becoming a blunt instrument. While Mel Gibson received a lot of backlash, Ayomide Adegun, as a young Sharon, was highly praised. He stepped into the pretty big shoes of the late Lance Reddick, a beloved actor who brought a resolute and quiet dignity to his role in the films, which wouldn't be an easy feat to accomplish. However, Adegun managed to nail the stoicism, the precise diction, and the moral compass that defined Sharon. His chemistry with Woodell's Winston was very consistent and gave fans a taste of the trusted bond we saw in later films. But other than them, the rest of the supporting cast was a mixed bag. The show gave us assassins, gangsters, revolutionaries, and loyalists, but barely any of them gave us a lasting impression. Lou and Yen, the martial arts-trained siblings who were drawn into Winston's world, were given screen time but barely any development. Frankie, on the other hand, who happens to be Winston's estranged brother, was rushed through the narrative beats and there was barely any emotional grounding. Ultimately, you could say that while the casting choices weren't disastrous, they failed to ignite the passion or the investment that the original franchise had. The show that was about loyalty, betrayal, and power play, The Continental, barely had any of the magnetic personalities that made the film iconic. The one thing about The Continental that was very bold as a choice was its 1970s setting. This kind of setting had full potential to give the Wickverse a whole new stylistic dimension, and on a visual aspect, the show was fully committed to its period backdrop. Rotary phones, polyester suits, and flickering neon signs with disco soundscapes painted a vivid picture of New York back when it was at its most grimy and dangerous. The Continental Hotel itself was reimagined as this noir cathedral, a place that felt both ancient and seedy. And honestly, for the most part, the production design simply ate. The costume department and set designers clearly did their homework. Everything, from the ashtrays on the side tables to the typeface on posters, felt authentic and real. This was an era before surveillance, before digital footprints, back when assassins had to operate on word of mouth instead of the high-tech underworld we saw in the Wick films. Everyone praised how the show paid attention to details and how grand the Continental looked. The problem is, looking good just wasn't enough. As visually impressive as the show was, the aesthetic of it didn't connect with the John Wick tone at all. The movie is well known for its sleek modernist elegance and operatic action. In contrast, The Continental was more like a crime drama. At times, it felt less like John Wick and more like American Gangster. The shift in tone was jarring for longtime fans, and this show seemed to want to rebrand the Wickverse instead of expanding on it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the show couldn't have worked. The groundedness of the show would have worked, but the context had to be different. With the clunky exposition and the bad pacing, the beautiful 70s backdrop ended up feeling more surface level than the producers wanted it to be. This made fans wonder if the show was even trying to be John Wick, or if it was trying to be something else completely. The main thing that made John Wick, well, John Wick, was the action. The franchise is quite literally built on it. Director Chad Stahelski, who used to be a stuntman, turned John Wick into a ballet of brutality. Every fight felt like a deadly dance, so you gotta wonder if the Continental even came close to that. The answer to that question isn't really simple. The third episode, directed by Albert Hughes, is the closest the Continental comes to capturing the essence of the franchise's kinetic magic. The final siege of the hotel gave us some slick and smooth hand-to-hand combat, as well as some extended gunplay, and we get a few moments of thrilling choreography. However, the rest of the show is uneven at its best. The first two episodes lack visual coherence in their fight scenes. Too many cuts, too many close-ups. The fight scenes looked less like gun fu and more like chaos. It's not like they couldn't have given it to us either. I mean, Liu and Yen, the two martial artists, could have given us fluid combat scenes. However, they were buried under erratic pacing and budget limitations, which made the Continental feel very cramped. The action in the Continental felt more like television than cinema. And let's not even talk about the issues of weapons. In John Wick, gunplay is the main meat and potatoes of the film. There's an almost obsessive indulgence in reloads, bullet counts, recoil, and sound design. By comparison, the Continental just has gunfights. They're exciting, but they're not as exhilarating or immersive as the gunfights in John Wick. The disconnect is the most damning indictment. If the spin-off of John Wick can't give us action, then what exactly is it giving us, or even trying to give us? Also, it's extremely hard to talk about the Continental without talking about its structure. The 3 feature-length episodes sound cinematic and dramatic on paper, but in practice, they felt disjointed and turned the story meandering. The first episode is all about the setup. We're introduced to all the characters and the stakes are established, but it feels completely overstuffed and undercooked. For example, the relationship between Winston and his brother is dealt with swiftly with barely any emotional buildup. The pacing of the show feels off, and the slow burns barely have any payoff. By the end of this episode, the viewers feel less satisfied and more disoriented. Then we have the second episode, which has to be the weakest of the 3. It veers off into subplots and we're introduced to new players, effectively sidelining the main conflict. The tone of the show shifts from gangster melodrama to awkward comedy to strained character drama. As a viewer, you end up getting whiplash. Only in the third episode does the show finally embrace the chaos and the style fans were hoping for. The finale goes big, and sure, we get a reasonably satisfying conclusion to Winston's arc, but the emotional payoff is minimal. The motivations behind Winston gaining the Continental never fully resonate. The show doesn't have the intimate emotional hook that the films had, and Winston's journey fails to hit in the gut. At the end of the day, the structure feels like a missed opportunity. Instead of being 3 feature-length movies, the show would have been much better off being 6-hour-long episodes, as that would allow much more world building and given us more cliffhangers to hold on to. When the Continental finally premiered, it barely had any fanfare, even though it was set in one of the most popular action universes of the past decade. There were no trending hashtags, no viral clips, and certainly no watch parties. For a franchise whose every film release dominated the pop culture conversation, the drop of the Continental was eerily quiet. Critics were divided among themselves about the show. Some praised the ambition and the effort it took to dive into the unexplored corners of John Wick's mythos. The show was praised for turning Winston into the central figure and for the vast world building they tried to achieve, but the majority of the reviews were lukewarm and negative. The show's inconsistent tone and lack of stakes was brought up over and over again. Critics on Rotten Tomatoes described the show as something self-serious and unsure of its own identity. The Continental had a hard time maintaining a fresh rating. It didn't bomb, but it didn't spark either. And the audience reception matched that of the critics. Fans took to Reddit to talk about the show's slow pacing and the underwhelming action. Longtime fans noted how the show was a missed opportunity. Even though it was expensive, it was clearly misdirected and nothing more than an attempt to capitalize on a beloved franchise. It was very telling how there was barely any discussion about the show. And then, when John Wick Chapter 4 dropped, fan forums lit up with theories, praise for the choreography, and debates about the ending. When you compare that with the way the Continental dropped, it was evident how badly the show messed up. And when Peacock dropped all 3 episodes, the network barely celebrated it or even promoted it. The viewer numbers weren't officially released, but it was already a nail in the coffin. Everybody was ready for it when the network confirmed that there were no plans for a second season. The show was originally designed as a miniseries, but producers were open to expanding it further if the show was popular. That door was quietly closed after the show struggled as much as it did. Despite taking 6 long years to develop, the Continental came and went like a hotel guest that no one bothered to notice. And that's what hurts about the Continental. It's not like it was unwatchable or incompetent. It wasn't. It had its moment. However, it failed massively on capitalizing on the full potential of the John Wick universe. Honestly, it was more like a collective shrug in the face of possibilities. Because, say what you want, the Wickverse is a goldmine for storytelling. The core idea of a global society of assassins operating under ancient codes with obscure currencies has potential, and the Continental could have been the gateway to it all. As the original plan mentioned, it would have been beautiful to watch the show flourish like that. I mean, imagine a Continental in Berlin, set in the Cold War era, and we see ex-Stasi agents running it. Or what about a season in Tokyo? We see the modern tech and samurai traditions clashing together. The blueprint was right there. But the Continental decided to narrow its scope and gave us barely anything. By anchoring the show in 1970s New York and the early days of Winston Scott, the series locked itself in a corner. The decision to focus on a single hotel made the universe smaller, and we focused more on internal politics instead of international ones. Gone was the borderless mystery of John Wick that got us all hooked on it in the first place. Even with the setting being in New York, the Continental gave us miss after miss. I mean, we don't know anything about the high table. The adjudicators barely made an appearance. The Bowery King who? The coin economy wasn't even mentioned, so we know nothing about how the code of conduct was created or how the Continental ended up becoming sacred and neutral ground. And I think, deep down, we all felt the absence of Keanu Reeves. There was no wink or nod to his character's mythos. I mean, I get that the producers wanted to not use him as a crutch, but that just made the show feel more disconnected from the heart of the franchise. The Continental could have been so much, but instead, it felt more like fan fiction without a budget. Imagine if we had seen a young, hungry Bowery King, or what if we got glimpses of Wick's training, showing us the impossible tasks that made him Baba Yaga. I mean, even a post-credit scene showing Winston and young John Wick in the same frame would have set the fandom on fire. Instead, we got a self-contained story that felt inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Now that we're looking back at it, the Continental feels like a franchise overreach. It wasn't a disaster like The Dark Universe or The Mummy that came out in 2017, but it definitely was a disaster in its own way. It serves as a reminder that just because a universe can be expanded doesn't mean it should be expanded without a clear vision. Because without that and compelling actors, the show risks being nothing but an ignorable piece of media. The Continental tried to be so many things at the same time. A prequel, a crime drama, a thriller, a period piece, and God knows what else. But by the end, it ended up becoming nothing. It didn't lack ambition, it simply lacked focus and emotional resonance, which would have acted as a narrative hook and made us care about the future of the characters. This is a classic paradox of franchise television, honestly. How can you tell a story that stands on its own while honoring the mythos it came from? The Continental could have answered that question, but instead, it postponed it. And now, the Wickverse is at a crossroads. Chapter 4 gave the character the proper send-off it deserved. The upcoming spin-off, Ballerina, with Ana de Armas and Keanu Reeves making a cameo, suggests that there is still gas and a Chapter 5 might just happen. But director Chad Stahelski has insisted that the team is not in any rush. So, with all that being said, the Continental simply exists on the side of the road, not essential and completely ignorable. So now, the question is, what is the future of John Wick and his world? Even though the Continental didn't do half the things Lionsgate had hoped for, with Chapter 4, it was evident that the John Wick franchise isn't going away anytime soon. In 2023, director Chad Stahelski revealed that he and Reeves don't plan on returning to the world of Wick unless they have something fresh to tell. Meanwhile, Ballerina promises to reconnect more directly with the mainline films. Set between Chapter 3 and 4, this movie will give us appearances from Lance Reddick, Ian McShane, and Keanu Reeves, giving us the narrative bridge that the Continental failed to give us. While Ballerina is using John Wick as context, the Continental wanted to create its own separate identity without Wick, and so far, Ballerina seems to be doing it right. This is a lesson Hollywood has failed to learn before. The expansion of the universe only works when you layer the stories instead of tearing them off from the roots. Because, in the end, it's not about gunfire or neon lights. John Wick is about loyalty, sacrifice, and consequences. And the Continental clearly forgot that. The Wickverse has so many compelling storylines simply waiting for someone competent to pick them up and explore. As for the Continental, it will stay as one of those stylish misfires. Not hated, not beloved, just simply tolerated. Marvelous verdict! In a way, we would say that the Continental was a bold experiment. It dared to expand the world of John Wick in its own way. It wanted to build the Wickverse without John Wick, and in its pursuit of that, it ended up cornering itself. It forgot the elegance, emotion, and unforgettable action that made the franchise so beloved in the first place. As the John Wick universe moves forward with Ballerina and possible sequels for Ballerina and John Wick, the Continental will always remain a reminder that world building only works when people remember who built the world in the first place. Personally, I'm very excited to see Ballerina and how the world of Wick gets expanded with the addition of Ana de Armas premise. What about you guys, though? We'd love to hear your thoughts on why the Continental didn't work in the comments down below. Bonus points if you throw in your thoughts about the upcoming ballerina, because we're really excited to read those too. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.